Hello everyone, RJM3 here. Welcome back to What If, the alternate history series where I speculate what could have been if history had gone differently. About 10 months ago, back in October, I published the video, What If the Confederacy Won Its Independence?
The goal with that video was to create a unique and fresh take on a scenario that was cliched and overdone, to serve as a deconstruction meant to challenge how we usually think of such a popular timeline, and for the most part, it succeeded in avoiding most of the tropes associated with a Confederate victory while remaining plausible. That video, which I highly recommend watching before this one if you haven't already, concluded that due to the Confederacy's reactionary politics and culture, they would have never abolished slavery on their own accord. Because of this, the CSA would have inevitably collapsed into a slave revolt, race war, and genocide in the early 20th century. That's what I believe would have been the most likely outcome for the South if they became an independent country. However, at the end of the video, I alluded to the possibility of continuing that scenario with the Confederacy surviving by abolishing slavery and seeing how the CSA would impact the 20th century.
And here we are, continuing from the 1900s and sticking to the same rule of avoiding cliches as last time. So without further ado, here is What If the Confederacy Won Its Independence, Part 2.
1904. Benjamin Tillman is President of the Confederate States. In our timeline, he was the 84th Governor of South Carolina, a United States Senator, and an incredibly horrific racist who aggressively opposed civil rights for Black Americans, leading a white supremacist paramilitary group known as the Red Shirts. And in this alternate timeline, he is the perfect candidate to represent the interests of the Confederate elite. Southern industry and agriculture is mostly reliant on slavery, with only a fraction of its labor force being paid workers. With the progressive movement in the North making great strides towards bettering economic opportunity, a Southern progressive movement is inspired to achieve that same goal with an emphasis on abolishing slavery. But this effort is doomed to fail because of the Confederate elite pulling the strings to block any progressive legislation in Congress and to utilize the police and agitated lynch mobs to suppress the movement. At this trajectory, the Confederacy will have a massive slave revolt in the coming years. Seeing an opportunity from the slave revolt, disenfranchised whites would also rise up against the Confederate government with socialist ideals. But due to the poor whites not actually caring about racial equality, only caring about being able to feed their families, as well as blaming the existence of slaves making jobs so scarce in the first place, and the former slaves having learned only to fear and distrust whites over the decades, these groups would very likely fight each other as well, leading to a Confederacy permanently shattered and scarred by civil war and racial conflict for decades. So, how do we avoid this? Well, it's really a matter of making the Southern progressive movement simply too big to fail, to a slightly unrealistic degree. The public's awareness of and disgust for the horrors of slavery suddenly and rapidly increase. Many young progressive candidates are elected to positions of power on the state and federal level. Legislation is passed in many states to limit the percentage of slaves companies can have in their workforce. This would force large factories and farms to not only hire more paid workers, but to also start selling off their slaves or freeing them, and as the demand for slavery falls, the former option becomes exponentially less viable. Some states would even pass legislation that abolishes slavery altogether. In the 1909 Confederate presidential election, a progressive candidate finally takes the White House, Virginia's very own Woodrow Wilson. In 1910, the Confederate Constitution is amended to outlaw slavery. The imminent collapse of the Confederacy is avoided, blue-collar workers are able to find jobs, and the slaves are finally free. Well, kinda. You see, in our timeline, after Reconstruction ended, the South wasted no time in implementing numerous laws to repress their black population, preventing them from achieving social mobility, from voting in elections, and from running for political office, effectively leaving Black Americans as second-class citizens. These laws, known as Black Codes, on paper applied to everyone, but in practice were only enforced on blacks. These ranged from rigged literacy tests to laws heavily criminalizing the most mundane things, such as walking alongside a railroad track, not having a job, raising your voice at a white woman, rolling dice, selling cotton after sunset, which really just meant selling cotton while black, and many, many more. When arrested for such offenses, the so-called criminals were forced to pay a rather hefty fine. More often than not, they weren't able to afford it. When that happened, the state would auction them off to a private individual or company and force them to pay off their fine through penal labor in horrific conditions, a practice known as convict leasing. Alternatively, a private individual could offer to pay the fine for the accused in exchange for being forced to work for that private individual in horrific conditions until that debt is paid off, a practice known as debt peonage. Now, if either of those two practices sound an awful lot like chattel slavery, that's because they are. The Black Codes, convict leasing, and debt peonage actively prevented the advancement of blacks in American society for decades and contributed heavily to the creation of the stereotype of black criminality. In this alternate timeline, following the official abolition of slavery in the Confederacy, all of that, the draconian laws enforced upon African citizens, the unofficial re-enslavement of a good chunk of the black population would all have still happened, just a few decades behind schedule. And the majority of Southern progressives really wouldn't care. From their perspective, the job is already done. The monstrosity of slavery had, on paper, been done away with, and the average Confederate man can finally make a living. There's no way the Southern progressive movement would have ever openly advocated for helping African Confederates catch up with the rest of Southern society. Not in that time period, and certainly not without destroying their own movement in the process. The black Confederate population is pretty much on their own for the next several decades. And I haven't even mentioned yet the very likely rise of an alternate Ku Klux Klan that would commit violence and intimidate black Confederates, which the Confederate government would very likely turn a blind eye to. After all, President Wilson was partially responsible for the revival of the KKK in our timeline, so why would he care about stopping any white supremacist militias in this one? While we're on the subject of Woodrow Wilson, in our timeline, he held an ideal of America utilizing its military might to spread its influence, to make the world safe for democracy. This idea is, of course, now known as Wilsonian Interventionism. This is what led to a good portion of the U.S. intervention in Latin America and eventually U.S. entry into World War I during Wilson's presidency. But as president of the Confederate States, Wilson would have incited a Cold War with the United States over control of Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine and American fruit companies versus Confederate Wilsonianism. The outbreak of the Mexican Revolution in 1910 would see the Union and Confederacy get caught up in the ever-confusing, tangled mess of factions and shifting alliances that the conflict was known for. The U.S. could support the Maderistas and the CS could support the Zapatistas one year, only to switch sides the next year due to shifting interests. Meanwhile, in Central America, the United States has been constructing the Panama Canal since 1904 after assisting the Panamanians achieve independence from Colombia, and construction will be completed in a few more years. After Wilson assumes office, he would want the Confederacy to build their own canal connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific, and the second best location to build such a canal would be Nicaragua. In 1911, under the guise of protecting Confederate values and helping the Nicaraguans achieve civilization, the CSA would invade Nicaragua, making it a Confederate territory. The Confederacy sends thousands of workers, mostly African Confederates from convict leasing, to begin construction of the Nicaraguan Canal in very terrible conditions, even when compared to the construction of the Panama Canal. This is also seen as an opportunity for many Southerners to ignore the issue of integration entirely by deporting thousands of blacks in the South to the Nicaraguan territory. The conditions of black settlements created in Nicaragua would, of course, also be terrible. The Confederate invasion of Nicaragua escalates tensions between North and South. The U.S. could establish protectorates over Honduras and Costa Rica in response. Haiti and the Dominican could be occupied by the Confederacy and the Union, respectively.
Huh. Look at the time.
1914. You know what that means. Before the two nations can ever directly come to blows over Latin America, the outbreak of World War I changes everything. The Union is very much not interested in getting involved in a European conflict, even less so than in our timeline. In this timeline's 1912 U.S. presidential election, even without any of the southern states, the Democratic Party would have still won the overwhelming majority of electoral college votes due to the split in the Republican Party between Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. So the US president at the time of the outbreak of the First World War would have been Speaker of the House James Beauchamp Clark, who narrowly lost the Democratic nomination to Wilson in our timeline. Unlike Wilson, Clark was very much opposed to entering the war even after the Zimmerman telegram, so President Clark would do everything in his power to keep America out of the fighting. This would include downplaying the sinking of American vessels by German U-boats, just as he did as Speaker in our timeline after the sinking of the Lusitania. The Confederacy, on the other hand, would play a more active role. Like in our timeline, Wilson would want to mediate between the Entente and the Central Powers to bring an end to hostilities and reshape the world order in his Wilsonian worldview, though with a bias towards Britain and France. In 1915, Wilson would warn the Germans to stop sinking Confederate passenger ships in the Atlantic. However, German leadership would not have seen the Confederacy as much of a legitimate threat as a united America. Not only would its armed forces be even more negligible than the US at the start of the conflict in our timeline, but would have also had a much smaller industrial capacity. So the Germans would have ignored Wilson's ultimatum, continuing unrestricted submarine warfare instead of pausing it in September of that year. So that same month, Wilson would ask for a declaration of war from Congress, and the Confederacy joins the Entente. As the South starts to mobilize, the next Confederate presidential election is around the corner, and the Confederate Constitution limits the presidency to a single 6-year term. So it would seem like Wilson won't get his chance to implement his vision for a post-war world. But Wilson was famous for expanding the powers of the executive branch in our timeline. Considering that, and the Confederacy's authoritarian tendencies mentioned back in Part 1, it would be pretty easy for Wilson to convince Congress to amend the Constitution to allow him to run for a second term for the sake of not swapping their leadership during a war. President Wilson, with his renewed hold on power, now has the chance to lead the Confederacy to war, defeat the Kaiser, and establish a new world order, a League of Nations, with Dixie at the helm. In mid-1916, Confederate troops finally arrive in France en masse. However, similar to the United States in our timeline, the Confederate military has little to no experience engaging in trench warfare. The Confederacy would have suffered the worst casualties of any Entente country at Verdun and the Somme. The majority of Confederate deaths in the conflict would happen in the first 12 months alone. Eventually, the Confederate military readjusts their strategy and tactics to fight more effectively. After 3 horrific years of bloodshed, the war finally ends with a ceasefire at 8 a.m. on August 8, 1918. The Confederacy was able to bring a somewhat quicker end to the conflict at the cost of about 100,000 Southern lives, making it the deadliest conflict in the country's history. And for all that carnage, Wilson's attempts to reshape the post-war world would come up short. The South was still perceived as a second or third-rate power, and its overall contribution to the war effort would have still been considered small when compared to the UK or France. During negotiations, fellow Entente leaders would have a harder time taking Wilson or any of his proposals seriously, coming across as arrogant and out of touch. There would have never been any League of Nations, no freedom of the seas, no guarantee of free trade, and no promise for the self-determination of all European nations. However, the outbreak of independence movements in Eastern Europe and the Balkans towards the end of the Great War, like in our timeline, would negate the consequences of that last point's rejection. But while the South was distracted in Europe, the North was able to turn the tide in Mexico, assisting Alvaro Obregón to victory. And to add injury to injury, after negotiations, Woodrow Wilson suffers a stroke, rendering him incapacitated and unable to lead, just like in our timeline. The Great War would have ultimately been a traumatic episode for the Confederate States of America. Countless young men, dead or crippled, and nothing to show for it. That, combined with the post-war recession caused by demobilization and the outbreak of the Spanish flu pandemic, the Confederacy would have been left disillusioned with the idea of interfering in global affairs, and will cling to more isolationist and conservative politicians in the coming election of 1921. And this is where I'm concluding part 2 of this scenario. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I hope you all will enjoy part 3 when it comes out another 10 months from now. Special thanks to Know Him Better and his video on neo-slavery for helping me do research for the portion of this video on the Black Codes, convict leasing, and debt peonage.
Also, thank you all for helping me get to 1,000 subscribers. I really appreciate it. Expect a Q&A announcement video right around the corner. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and follow me on Instagram, This has been RJM3, Alternate Historian. Have a nice day.